Okay. So today we're going to do a deep dive into something that's causing quite a stir in the world of global trade.
Yeah.
President Trump just announced some pretty big tariffs. We're talking a 10% blanket tariff on imports from just about everywhere, like 185 countries or so.
No,
And then on top of that, you've got even bigger hikes for some of the major players, the
right.
EU, China, Japan. China in particular is now looking at a whopping 54% in tariffs. People are calling this the biggest shift we've seen in global tariffs in modern U.S. history.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a big move. Signals a real change in direction for how the U.S. approaches trade, both in terms of, just how big it is and who it's targeting.
Definitely. And President Trump was pretty clear about his intentions in the announcement. He called it Liberation Day, talked about a rebirth for American industry, reclaiming America's destiny, all that. He even said America has been looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by foreign nations for decades. Yeah, strong words. And his message was really focused on American workers, the steel workers, auto workers, farmers, skilled tradespeople. He's arguing they've been hit hard by unfair competition from overseas. So I want to ask you, when you hear that kind of rhetoric, Liberation Day tied to economic policy, what comes to mind? Are there any historical echoes or economic ideologies that help us make sense of this? What could it mean for the future?
Well, that kind of nationalist framing, the idea that protectionist measures can somehow liberate the economy, we've seen that before throughout history.
Yeah.
There are definitely parallels to mercantilist ideas where the goal was to build up national wealth by having more exports than imports and protecting domestic industries.
Right.
And historically, those approaches, they've had mixed results, to say the least.
Yeah.
Often they just lead to trade wars and all sorts of unintended consequences. And the language that's being used here, looted, pillaged, it really taps into this sense of national identity and grievance. That can be a powerful force driving policy changes, even when the economic realities are a lot more complicated.
Yeah. Complicated is a good word for it. And to help us unpack all of this complexity and figure out what these tariffs might really mean for the U.S. and the world, we've got Professor Richard Wolff with us today. Now he's Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor at the New School, founder of Democracy at Work, and the host of Economic Update. He knows a thing or two about capitalism and global economics, which is exactly what we need right now. So Professor Wolff, thanks for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So just your initial reaction when you heard about these tariffs, the sheer scope of them, were you surprised by just how big and how broad this announcement was?
Well, President Trump's been leaning towards tariffs for a while now, so it wasn't a total shock. But I'd have to say that the sweep and the scale of these measures are pretty remarkable. It's definitely something that demands our attention. But the way he's presenting it, this whole Liberation Day thing, and the idea that the U.S. has been some kind of victim, it just feels like a huge oversimplification to me. More like political showmanship than an accurate reflection of how the global economy has actually worked over the past 50 years.
Right. So let's talk about that victim narrative a bit more. You mentioned that the U.S. has actually benefited from the global economic system. How so?
Well, for the last 50 years or so, the United States has played a major role in shaping the global economic order, and it's benefited greatly from it. Now, I know certain sectors and certain groups of people in the U.S. have faced real challenges because of global competition. But overall, the U.S. economy has done very well, especially those at the top. They've seen massive wealth accumulation. So to say that the U.S. has just been a victim of other countries' economic policies ignores the fact that the U.S. has been actively involved in creating and profiting from this system. This tendency to blame others, I think, is a kind of sad way of dealing with what looks like a decline in America's economic power.
That's an interesting point about decline. You've even compared it to the fall of the British Empire. Can you tell us more about that comparison?
Well, history shows us that empires don't last forever. The 20th century was really the American century, a time of U.S. economic and political dominance. But the 21st century is different. We're seeing the rise of other economic powers, and the global landscape is much more diffuse. But instead of facing up to this new reality and adapting there seems to be this temptation in the U.S. to point fingers, blame other countries for our problems. We saw something similar with the decline of the British Empire. There was a period where they struggled to come to terms with their changing global status, and they started lashing out, blaming and punishing others instead of looking inward and making adjustments.
So you're saying that the world is unlikely to just sit back and accept these tariffs. The Secretary of the Treasury has warned against retaliation, but you seem to think that's inevitable. Why is that?
Well, the idea that the rest of the world is just going to take these tariffs lying down without doing anything to protect their own interests. That's just not realistic. The U.S. doesn't have the same kind of economic clout it used to. We're not calling the shots anymore. And frankly, a warning against retaliation might actually encourage it. If other countries see that the U.S. can act aggressively without any consequences, they might be tempted to do the same. They have their own economic concerns, and they're going to want to defend their industries. Retaliatory tariffs are almost a given.
Okay, so let's clear up some confusion about how tariffs actually work, because President Trump has said that foreign countries will be paying for them. But you've said it's actually American companies that foot the bill initially. Can you explain that?
Sure. A tariff is basically a tax on goods that are imported into a country. So let's say you have a product that's made outside the U.S. and it's coming here to be sold. When that product crosses the border, the American company that's importing it has to pay a tax to the U.S. government. That's the tariff. And while those companies might try to pass those extra costs on to consumers by raising prices, the fact is they're the ones who pay the tariff up front. So the idea that foreign countries are directly paying for these tariffs is just not accurate. It's really an American tax on imported goods.
And this seems like a big shift for the Republican Party, which has always been about lower taxes. Imposing what you've called the most massive tax imaginable seems pretty contradictory. What do you think is behind this change?
Yeah, you're right. That's a really important point. The scale of these tariffs is huge. It amounts to a massive tax increase on all sorts of things that Americans buy and use. And it does seem to go against the traditional Republican position on taxes. But I think what's happening is that they see the U.S. facing some very serious economic problems. And this is their attempt to solve those problems by protecting American industries from foreign competition and maybe generating some government revenue along the way. Whether it will actually work is another question, given how much the global economy has changed and the fact that the U.S. isn't as powerful as it used to be. I'm pretty skeptical.
No, we also heard from Shawn Fain, the president of the United Auto Workers, UAW, and he actually supports these tariffs. He sees them as a way to undo what he calls the free trade disaster and bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. He pointed out that something like 90,000 manufacturing facilities and 65 plants in the big three automakers have left the U.S. in recent decades, which is a pretty alarming statistic. So how do you reconcile that perspective from labor with your own economic concerns?
Well, I understand why unions like the UAW would see tariffs as a solution to the job losses in manufacturing. The numbers that President Fain cited are really troubling. They show a long-term decline in certain industries. And for the workers and communities that have been hit hard by plant closures and jobs moving overseas, the idea of bringing those jobs back through tariffs is very appealing. And President Fain is absolutely right to insist that if those jobs do come back, they need to be good jobs with decent wages, health care, and retirement security.
But you've also said that you're worried about the potential negative effects of these tariffs on American workers. What are your main concerns? Why do you think this might not work out the way people hope?
My worry is that the overall economic impact of these tariffs will end up hurting working people. First of all, as we've talked about, tariffs are taxes, and those taxes are probably going to mean higher prices for all kinds of goods that Americans buy. That's inflation, and it hits low-income families the hardest. On top of that, when you have less competition from foreign companies because of tariffs, domestic producers might start raising their prices too. So that's even more inflation. And then there's the issue of retaliation. When other countries retaliate with their own tariffs, which they almost certainly will, is going to hurt American exports. That means job losses in those sectors, including auto workers who make cars for export. And the biggest unknown is whether the number of jobs created by these tariffs will be greater than the number of jobs lost due to retaliation and higher costs throughout the economy. It's a big risk. It's kind of like a Hail Mary pass in football, a desperate move with a low chance of success.
So let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger economic picture. How do these tariffs fit in with the tax cuts that President Trump passed earlier in his term, and what kind of dilemma is he facing now?
Well, these tariffs were happening against the backdrop of those 2017 tax cuts, which mostly benefited corporations and wealthy individuals, as base. And those tax cuts are set to expire in 2025. If that happens, those who benefited the most will see their taxes go up significantly, which is something President Trump probably wants to avoid. But if he tries to extend those tax cuts without making major cuts to government spending, the U.S. is going to have to keep borrowing more and more money, adding to the national debt. And that's not sustainable, especially since the U.S. relies on foreign countries to lend it money. So he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. How can he keep his supporters happy and manage the country's finances at the same time?
And it seems like one strategy might be to cut spending. You've even mentioned Elon Musk's mass layoffs as an example of this approach. What's the connection there?
Well, it's not a direct connection, but the example of Elon Musk firing all those people does illustrate a certain way of thinking about economic problems. The idea is to cut costs, often by laying off workers, to make businesses more efficient and profitable. And it seems like the strategy behind these tariffs and the idea of extending the tax cuts is that somehow this will make American industry strong enough to overcome any negative consequences. But the problem is that the tariffs themselves are going to raise costs for consumers, which could lead to demands for higher wages. And then businesses might resist those demands by laying off workers or hiring fewer people. So in the end, this approach could actually make life worse for American workers. It could raise their cost of living and make it harder to find a job or get a raise.
Now let's shift gears and talk about the global political landscape. It seems like these tariffs are having some unintended consequences when it comes to alliances and reactions from other countries.
Absolutely. One of the most interesting and maybe unexpected outcomes of these tariffs is how they're changing the global political map. For instance, the European Union, despite all its internal divisions, is finding common ground in their opposition to what they see as American economic aggression. And even more striking is the fact that countries like China, Japan, and South Korea, which have a lot of historical baggage and tension between them, are now talking about cooperating more closely on economic matters and coordinating their response to these U.S. tariffs. So in a way, the U.S. is actually pushing these countries closer together by acting unilaterally.
You've used some pretty strong language to describe this situation. You've said that the U.S. is becoming contained and isolating itself, and maybe even becoming a rogue nation economically. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, if you look at voting patterns at the United Nations, you can see that the U.S. is increasingly isolated on a lot of international issues. And now with these tariffs, we're seeing a move towards economic isolation as well. When other major economic powers start to see the U.S. as an unreliable or even hostile partner, it can lead to a situation where the U.S. is increasingly viewed as a rogue nation, someone who doesn't play by the rules of international trade. And when you look at the specific tariffs that have been imposed on countries like Taiwan and Vietnam, without seeming to consider the long history of U.S. involvement in those regions, it just reinforces that impression that the U.S. is acting unilaterally and without much regard for its existing relationships. It paints a picture of a country that's struggling to come to terms with its declining power and lashing out in ways that could do a lot of damage.
Now, we also have a different perspective from Yanis Varoufakis, the former finance minister of Greece. He's suggesting that President Trump might understand that these tariffs won't actually reduce the trade deficit directly, but that they're meant to pressure foreign central bankers into lowering interest rates in their own countries. What's the thinking behind that theory?
Yeah, Yanis Varoufakis always has an interesting take on things. He's a very sharp thinker. His argument is that Trump might be using these tariffs not so much to limit imports directly, but as a way to force central banks in other big economies like the Eurozone, Japan, and China to lower their interest rates. The idea is that lower interest rates in those countries would weaken their currencies, the euro, the yen, and the renminbi compared to the US dollar. And a weaker euro, yen, and renminbi would offset the price increases caused by the tariffs on goods imported from those countries. So basically, Varoufakis is saying that Trump is trying to make those other countries pay for his policies by manipulating their currencies.
And you often agree with Varoufakis' analyses, but you're not so sure about this one.
Well, I do respect Yanis's insights into global finance and economics, but I'm not convinced by this particular interpretation. It's true that a weaker euro, yen, and renminbi is a possible outcome, given how interconnected global financial markets are. But I don't think that was Trump's main goal in imposing these tariffs, and I don't think it's the most likely result. Global economic forces are very complex, and there are so many factors that influence exchange rates. It's very hard to predict what will happen.
You've said repeatedly that it's very difficult to predict the outcomes of these tariffs. It's not as simple as imposing a tax and getting a guaranteed result.
Exactly. Economic history and theory both teach us that tariffs can have lots of different consequences, many of them unforeseen. The actual impact depends on a whole range of interconnected factors like interest rates, exchange rates, the overall health of the U.S. and global economies. There are no easy answers or guaranteed outcomes. What we're seeing is a major shift away from the idea of free trade or neoliberalism, which has been the dominant approach to global economic policy for the past 50 years. The U.S. seems to be realizing that it can't win in that system anymore, so it's moving towards economic nationalism. This is a fundamental change, and it's hard to say what the long-term consequences will be.
So are you suggesting that President Trump's motives might have more to do with politics and his unwillingness to accept that the U.S. is losing its economic edge than with any kind of coherent economic strategy?
That's my assessment. While there might be some people advising him who genuinely believe that tariffs are a good idea, I think the main driving force behind this policy is President Trump's desire to appeal to his base project an image of strength and leadership and avoid the uncomfortable truth that the global economic order is changing and the U.S. is no longer at the top. This move towards economic nationalism, I think, is likely to make global economic tensions worse and could even lead to more conflict between the big economic blocs, Europe, Asia, and America. And this is happening at a time when the U.S. is arguably weaker both economically and politically than it used to be. The situation in Ukraine is a good example of how miscalculations in global politics can have devastating consequences.
So finally, Professor Wolff, you've made a pretty bold statement. You've said that you believe this is the beginning of the end of the American empire. What makes you say that?
Well, I've been thinking for at least 10 or 12 years now that the American empire is in decline. And one of the key signs of that is the changing balance of global economic power. If you compare the combined GDP of the G7 countries, which includes the U.S. and its major allies, to the combined GDP of China and the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, you'll see that the G7 now makes up a smaller share of the global economy, about 28%, while China and the BRICS make up about 35%. That's a significant reversal from the past. When countries are thinking about big infrastructure projects or looking for economic partners, they don't automatically turn to Washington or London anymore. They're increasingly looking to Beijing, New Delhi, and Sao Paulo, and they're often getting better deals there. The world is becoming truly multipolar, and the U.S. is no longer the undisputed leader. It's like someone who's struggling with an addiction. They need to admit they have a problem before they can start to recover. The U.S. needs to face the reality of its declining global influence before it can deal with its problems both at home and abroad. These tariffs feel to me like the actions of a country that's not willing to accept that reality.
Professor Wolff, thank you so much for this incredibly insightful analysis of these tariffs and what they mean for the world.
It was my pleasure.
So just to recap, we've heard President Trump say that these tariffs are a sign of American economic revival, a liberation day. But Professor Wolff has offered a different perspective, one of a U.S. in decline, making risky moves with unpredictable global consequences. The key takeaways for you listening are that these tariffs are essentially a tax that will mostly affect American consumers and businesses, that there's going to be a strong reaction from other countries, and that this whole thing reflects deeper problems within the U.S. economy and its place in a world where power is shifting away from the West.
It's a very uncertain time, and the long-term consequences of these policies could be huge both for the global economy and for international relations.
And on that note, here's something for you to think about. Given all this talk about economic nationalism, what do you think it means for the future of globalization and the interconnected world we live in? What could be the long-term effects on global stability and our own individual lives? It's definitely something to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.